Hello, and we're back to talk a little bit about our second major text, the Hebrew Bible, and also I shouldn't really say text, texts as well. We'll see, and also to reflect, still reflect a little bit about on Gilgamesh in relation to it, and you know. Last time when we were talking about Gilgamesh, I focused a lot about this sort of dichotomy, this oppositional nature between wilderness and civilization, and how key it is to this sort of early Bronze Age um, uh, uh, advocacy for a certain way of living. We talked a little bit about the gods in Gilgamesh, probably not as much as we could have, of course, but we saw a lot of one of the things about epic, of course, is that it often involves um, gods being involved in the affairs of mortals, and certainly we see that in Gilgamesh. We talked a little bit about Ninurtu and the creation of Enkidu, for instance, in response to Ururu's commands when the people complain about Gilgamesh. We didn't talk as much about Ishtar and her attempted seduction of Gilgamesh and how her rage sets in motion the death of Enkidu, the bull of heaven. But clearly, divine, very much intertwined with the affairs of mortal men, characteristic of epic, but of course also characteristic of quote unquote religious texts. And so we're talking about the Bible today. We're obviously going to continue to talk about the connection between the human and the divine. And of course, Genesis is a lot different than why is my head so? I'm moving my head down a little bit here. Genesis is a lot different than Gilgamesh, the Hebrew Bible. Certainly there are similarities, right? They're both works from the ancient Near East. The origins of the Hebrew Bible are in the late Bronze Age, and a lot of the events depicted are Bronze Age events, especially in Genesis. The most of the texts, though, probably dates to what we could more properly call the Iron Age, which begins around the 11th century BC. We don't have to put too fine a point on these things. First of all, because nobody really knows with any certainty when any of this stuff was actually written. We have theories, we have guesses, right? We know that it makes no sense to talk about a single origin for Gilgamesh because we talked about its oral traditions, and of course that is doubly, triply, quadruply true of the Hebrew Bible, which the individual stories themselves began as oral folk tales and traditions, obviously, but the many books that make up the Hebrew Bible, or individual texts that make up the Hebrew Bible, all come from different time periods, and it's really difficult to not just to date them, but also to think of them. You can't think of them in terms of sort of unfolding narrative chronologically. The Bible begins, of course, with Genesis 1, which we're going to talk about today, and that is one of the more recent. These scholars think that's fairly new, recent in terms of biblical material, maybe from as late as the 4th century or even the 3rd century BC. Whereas something like the Song of Deborah from the book of Judges, from Judges 5, which is a little bit of which is a sort of victory poem, from much later in the Bible in terms of the text of the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, right? The Judges comes way after Genesis. It's not even in the Pentateuch. It's in what's called the Ketubim, right? The historical writings. Dates from maybe as far back as the very end of the Bronze Age, like the 12th century BC. So if you think about it, right, just think about that for a second, right? So if the Genesis 1 is from like the 4th century BC. Let's give it an early date. And the Song of Deborah from the Book of Judges is from the 12th century. We're talking about 800 years difference. It's really hard to think of this as any kind of unified whole, and you shouldn't, because it's not. The Hebrew Bible is a chaotic collection of fragments and tales and stories, and legal documents, and religious ritualistic instructions and things like that, which come from different places, different times, different authors, and have different purposes. And when you see them, all published in a book as the Old Testament, right, which is what Christians call it, or even more so if you were ever in a synagogue and you've seen it all collected in a Torah scroll, right, and it looks like this beautiful whole, right, this thing you can imagine being handed down to Moses by God. That's not historical reality. So our job here is to, it's tricky because, of course, this is a religious text, and this is not a religion. This isn't like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Babylonian Enuma Elish, or something like that. This is a religious text that is still very important to millions of people today, not just Jews, of course, but this is also the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. And so, I want to be sensitive to the fact that these stories are still meaningful to many people, maybe even meaningful to you as religious stories, as truth, right? I respect that immensely. But that's a separate question from our job as scholars, right? To think about these texts not just as the texts themselves as we find them, but also to think about them in the larger context of ancient Near East, the history of literature, right? And really think about these texts as literature and ways that we can connect them to what we have already read and what we will be reading moving forward. All right, so let me get the slideshow going here. Let's start with a map. I have a lot to say today. This is, as you can probably tell from the Gilgamesh lecture, that I have a lot to say. I have a lot of thoughts about the ancient Near East, and I love talking about the ancient Near East. And I love talking about all this stuff. It's my job, after all. But I won't lie, this is my favorite class to teach for many reasons. So bear with me here. Here's another map of the same region, more or less, that we had for Gilgamesh. It's the ancient Near East again. It has a little zoom in here on Canaan, which is, of course, such an important place in the Hebrew Bible. It is the promised land. It's roughly what we would today call Israel, although there is no continuity between what the Old Testament. I don't know what term am I going to use here? The Hebrew Bible, I guess. I don't like Old Testament because that puts everything in a sort of Christian context. It's only the Old Testament to Christians. To Jews, it's the only Testament. Let's go with Hebrew Bible. That works. What the Hebrew Bible calls Israel, Yisrael, or Canaan, Canaan, or the kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the later books of the Bible that are ruled by David and Solomon and Saul and those guys, has no political connection, continuity with this modern state of Israel, which is a totally separate thing. And so don't conflate. I'm not I'm not making any political claims here to anything. I'm just saying that geographically, this is where the modern state of Israel is, also more or less and you can call it Palestine. You can say that the state of Israel is illegitimate. Whatever you want to think. It's not talking about modern politics at all. Just want to make that clear. We can talk about that in office hours if you ever feel like it, but it's not part of this class. Okay. So yeah, here of course are our old friends, the Tigris and Euphrates River. That would make this, of course, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and Abraham, who was the first Jew, the first proper Jew. At least that's how Jews think of him. Um, is wanders around. When he leaves his homeland and in search of the land of Canaan, this is his track right here. Right here's Ur, one of those Sumerian city states that that became part of the Assyrian Empire later, very near Uruk, our city last time from Gilgamesh, and you can see he wanders all around. Um, and eventually makes it to the land of Canaan. But basically, what I'm trying to make, the point I'm trying to make here is that the Hebrew Bible is part of ancient Near Eastern literature. It's a little more Iron Age than Bronze Age, the way Gilgamesh is, but its origins and the events it depicts are very much of the Bronze Age, ancient Near East. And you cannot think about the Hebrew Bible as happening in a vacuum, nor can you think about it the way we typically do today as part of some like Western Christian tradition. I mean, it's not. Well, I shouldn't say that. Of course it is, because it's very important to influencing later writers of the Western tradition, but its origins are very much in the ancient Near East, the ancient Middle East, and are very much connected to the kind of world we encountered in Gilgamesh, these ancient early urban culture, these ancient Bronze Age civilizations, and their dealings with each other, and their natures as societies, right? All right. So the Hebrew Bible begins with Genesis. Of course, the real name is Bereshit. Bereshit is the name of the first book of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, right? The 5 books purportedly written by Moses in tradition. Of course, were not written by Moses, who may or may not have existed. But Bereshit is the name of the book. You may hear me refer to it that way. Genesis is a Greek word that means roughly the same thing, in the beginning. And it is a book of origins, of beginnings, right? It is what we would call a cosmogony. That is a story about creation, about the origin of the universe. Cosmogonies come from many different cultures. I don't know why they took it out, but the longer we're using the shorter Norton Book of World Literature, and the full one has a Babylonian cosmogony called the Enuma Elish, which I love to teach, and I love to teach it in relation to Genesis. I don't know why they took it out. It's not in this version, but c'est la vie, it's not. But of course, there are cosmogonies from every different culture. The Egyptians had their cosmogony. Maybe some of the stories of the ancient Greeks, right? Prometheus stealing the secret of fire, etc., etc., or the war between the Titans and the gods. This is just one cosmogony among many produced by human cultures from its earliest days, right? Probably some of the first stories that people told each other were stories about where this all came from. Because it is a question that occurs to almost everybody at some point. And today, of course, we have our scientific cosmogonies, the Big Bang. Right? Everything began as a singularity, and then at some point, the universe expanded out at incredible speeds and energies, right? And then gravity caused whatever, energy turned into matter and matter clumped together, gravitational forces and electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces. It's all very religious sometimes. when you read a sort of narrative of the Big Bang, it's not that much different than a religious cosmogony. And I'm not saying it's not true or that the theory is wrong or anything like that. Just that, um, you know, there's a lot of imagination that goes into it too, I'm sure. And you have to take some things as an article of faith. Um, Nevertheless, right? This is a cosmogony that most of us are familiar with, right? The one from Genesis 1. And there's actually two cosmogonies in Genesis, and which is something that sometimes people miss. There are two cosmogonies in Genesis, not just one, and they don't actually agree with each other. And that is going to get us to a little bit of discussion about sort of the provenance of these texts. Okay, Genesis is a story about birthright, about a people, and that also, there's a relation here to Gilgamesh in the sense that Gilgamesh is also very much a story about kind of like national origins, right? The founding of Uruk, and how Uruk is the thing which will outlast Gilgamesh, even though that he himself is mortal and is doomed to die. The walls of Uruk, ramparted Uruk, right? The foundation of the civilization, right? Genesis is the story of the origins of the worshippers of Yahweh, the Israelites. I'm going to deals with the origins of the Israelites as a chosen people promised the land of Canaan, which is, of course, still causing issues today, by Yahweh. And if you've never heard the word Yahweh before, it's pretty amazing because it features very prominently in this text. Although you wouldn't know it if you've only ever been exposed to Bibles as they are written in English, translated into English. Yahweh is the name of the God of the Hebrews, of the Israelites. And everything that happens in this text grows out of a cult of Yahweh worshippers that goes all the way back to Bronze Age, the Bronze Age Levant, in the Middle East. More on that in a second. There's a covenant, right? A pact between Yahweh and his people. Worship, you worship me as your God, and in return you will get protection, you will get prosperity, right? And the covenant is marked or sealed by the act of circumcision, which I'm sure is something that you're all familiar with. The Jews to this day still practice. I guess everybody practices it now. Well, not everybody. In the United States, it's pretty common. Not so common in other places. But it's also a story about the search for a homeland, right? Abraham's journeys and wanderings, which is part of what I assigned to read. We're not going to get to talk about Abraham, maybe even Cain and Abel in our discussion today, but it is certain part of the assigned readings that, right, Abraham's story in Genesis, later in Genesis, and what the Jews call Parshat Lech Lecha, is about him leaving as an article on faith, right? Hearkening to Yahweh's call and leaving his homeland somewhere in Mesopotamia, or around there, and wandering around until he finds this land flowing with milk and honey, Canaan. And then later, of course, in the book of Exodus, which I haven't assigned yet. The book of Exodus, I'm not even sure if we're going to get to it. I got to check the syllabus. The Jews will end up slaves in Egypt, and then we'll have to find Canaan again after 40 more years of wandering in the desert. So, the idea of the land is very important to this text, and this is a land that belongs to the Israelites. It's promised to the Israelites by Yahweh, and they want to make a kingdom there. There are fits and starts. There are problems along the way, and they stray from the path. Yahweh punishes them or allows them to become, lots of stuff happens in the course of all of these books of the Bible. They eventually do found these kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the Iron Age. Probably these are historically kingdoms that actually existed, as far as we know. Whether the actual kings the mythic kings of the Bible, actually like David and Solomon, actually existed is a little more iffy, I think. But anyway, all right, let's. I want to talk. Okay, well, hang on documentary hypothesis for a second. So let's get out of the slideshow for a second. And one of the things that is important to keep in mind, moving my head here around, one of the things that we always got to keep in mind, I said this before when we were studying Gilgamesh, is that nothing that we're reading, well, there will be a couple things, but almost very few things that we're reading in this class were written in English. And some of the ones that were written in English are written in Old English that we couldn't possibly understand today, like Beowulf. So almost everything we're reading is, at least until toward the very end of the semester, is in translation, and often translated from these very ancient languages that almost nobody knows. We talked last time about cuneiform, and I showed you that cuneiform tablet and what it looks like, and I talked about the fact that cuneiform was used to write many different languages. Originally Sumerian, which is a unicorn language. It's not related to anything else we know today. And then later Akkadian, which the form of Gilgamesh we have today was written in. And Akkadian is a little more convenient for translation because it's a Semitic language, belongs to the Semitic family of languages, and therefore it is related to languages that are still spoken today. That brings us to Genesis, which is, of course, originally written in Hebrew, ancient biblical Hebrew, which is a little different than modern Hebrew that they speak in Israel today, which is itself a kind of language that kind of had to be made up or sort of resurrected in the 20th century. It's an late 19th century. It's a very interesting story. Not our story for today, though. But now, I think it's important to give a sense of what these texts actually looked like and sounded like in their original language as best I can. I am not a linguist. Don't want to give the wrong impression. I am not some kind of like polymath or super linguistic genius of any kind. I am not. But I do like to give a little taste of still what these texts sounded like. And I'm lucky that I have some training and ability to do so for some of the languages of the text that we're going to be reading. Obviously, I don't know anything about ancient Sumerian or ancient Akkadian, nor can I read cuneiform. You need like a PhD in Assyriology to do that. So I couldn't help you with Gilgamesh, but I'm much better with Genesis here. Now, I mentioned before, this is Genesis chapter 1. It's right at the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, but it is not by far the first thing that was written. It's fairly recent in terms of ancient literature. Genesis 1 is probably more recent than the Iliad, for example, from ancient Greece. So we don't really think of it usually that way, right? But it's there are parts of the Hebrew Bible that are much older, as I said. But okay, this is 4th century maybe. Genesis 1. I want to go into the original Hebrew for a second. Now, I don't expect you to read any Hebrew or know any Hebrew or be able to read any Hebrew or anything like that. That's not what this is about. This is about demonstrating what I mean when I talk about the authorship of Genesis being very complex, right? Okay, so in English, right, we have our own translation of the book, which we'll obviously need to refer to. I think it's an awful translation, just horrible. I hate it, but it's what we got, and we're going to use it, right? But for now, I got this up on the screen. We can just look at this. In the beginning, God's creation of the heavens and the earth. In Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And actually, what it really sounds like, because when you're reading biblical Hebrew, you don't just say the words, you also have to kind of sing it. There are notes, and the musical notations are under the words, right? Some of these are vowels, right? Because Hebrew has no vowels. But these little squiggles and this little wishbone thing, those are musical notes. And because I am Jewish, and because my rabbi taught me this when I was 13 years old, I can tell you what it sounds like. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. And what it means is, Bereshit means in the beginning. This is the word Bereshit right here. I use my highlighter. Bereshit, in the beginning. That's Bereshit, right? Bara Elohim, in the beginning. Bara Elohim. Elohim is the word for God. And bara means made or created. Et hashamayim. Shamayim means sky. The et haaretz. This is aretz, right? Aretz means ground. The sky and the ground. So in the beginning, God made the sky and the ground, or as it's usually translated, the heavens and the earth. But so here's this word Elohim. And I'm gonna grab a doc. I should have done this. Will this work? I want to try to copy and paste this. Hang on. This is for later. So let's see. Look at that, it worked. Okay, so there it is in Hebrew. The word Elohim. Hebrew's read right to left, so this is the A, this is the L, this is the H, this is the Y, this is the M. And usually it's written in English as... Come on, there we go. It's kind of, my computer's all confused. Doesn't know if I want to go right to left or left to right. Elohim. Elohim. It means God. It's derived from the word El, right? Which was originally the name of a Canaanite god. It was part of a larger pantheon of gods. But it evolved to sort of just mean God. And Elohim is a plural form of that word. Doesn't really matter. Why is it plural? Think of it as like a royal plural. I don't know exactly. There's a whole lot of scholarship on why it's Elohim is plural and not singular. But it means God. Right? It means God. It's the word God. And so when Elohim appears in the Hebrew text, right, it is translated as God, right? In the beginning, God's creation of the heavens and the earth, right? God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this is Genesis 1, and Genesis 1 gives us a particular account of creation, right? And let's go back here for a second. Where was I? My computer's getting angry at me. All right, well, let's turn to the books for a second. All right, might be easier for us to just use the books here, even though I don't really like the translation. All right. Page 80 in our text. When God began to create heaven and earth, and the earth was welter and waste. In other words, the earth was very empty. Everybody knows this, right? This part, right? And darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters. That's God's breath. The word, sometimes it's translated as the Spirit of God, right? Or the soul of God or something like the Spirit of God in this translation. The Hebrew word is ruach. It's an important word. Where are you, ruach? Here it is. Beruach Elohim. Beruach Elohim means the soul, the Spirit of God, or the breath of God, and was hovering over the face of the water, right? And God said, "Let there be light." Vayehi or, and there was light. Yehi or. So God speaks. The first thing that is created is light. It's this really wonderful, feels like this very deeply mythic moment. The interesting thing is it's not like that old, as I said, right? There are much older things in the Bible than this. This feels very primal, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and God was hovering over the face of the water. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and God separated between the light and the darkness, and the light he called day, and the darkness he called night, and it was evening and morning the first day, or one day, right? Uh, God here in Genesis 1, interesting, a little different kind of than what we saw in Gilgamesh with somebody like, for instance, Ninurta or Ishmael. Sorry, not Ishmael. Ishtar. Ishmael's from Moby Dick. Ishtar, right? Who are like, they're beings, right? They're these physical beings. Ninurta gets down in the dirt and scoops up the clay and makes Gilgamesh. Enkidu. Ishtar is the female goddess. She comes to Gilgamesh and tries to seduce him. She wants to have sex with him. She's a physical being of some kind, right? Whereas God here in Genesis 1 is this spirit, right? Ruach Elohim, the spirit of God, this sort of disembodied thing hovering over the face of the earth, of the formless, voidless earth, and speaking things into existence with his voice. This is a much more modern, to our eyes, idea of like what God is and supposed to be, right? You know, but if you look at other ancient cultures, you know that it's not always the case, right? If, of course, we all know a little bit of Greek mythology from school, right? And we remember, that Zeus liked to, have relations with human women, and the gods were always sort of meddling in the affairs of mortals in physical ways, right? They would appear and they would have embodiment as people, right? They weren't disembodied, sort of wraith-like things like God is, and the sort of modern conception of God as being nothing embodied but a kind of spirit, right? And then so God goes on to create the world in Genesis 1. I'll just keep on using my screen if you don't mind. It's the same text. Our text and this text, they're both fine in their way. There's not that many differences, but for some reason, the translator in our text uses lots of like weirdly poetic terms like welker and waste that I don't find are particularly helpful, and I don't really like his grammar sometimes. For instance, he begins his translation when God began to create the heaven and earth, which leaves out the Bereshit, the in the beginning thing, which is pretty iconic. In the beginning, Bereshit, God created the heavens and the earth. I don't know why you leave that out. Anyway, he's the one that gets paid to do it. That was Robert Alter, by the way. I don't know. He's more smarter than I am. He's more famous than I am. He's got a better job than I've got, so I shouldn't complain, perhaps. But all right. So God goes on through these 6 days of creation, speaking things into existence with his voice. Right. Let there be this. Let there be that. God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, and let it be separated between water and water." And God made the expanse, and it separated between the water that was below the expanse and the water that was above the expanse, and it was so, right? So like the clouds above and the oceans beneath. And God called the expanse heaven, and it was evening, and it was morning, a second day. Again, the word for heaven, shamayim, which means sky. So I don't think of this necessarily as like some otherworldly realm. He's not creating like heaven, like the pearly gates and everything. He's creating the sky, the firmament, right? The thing that human beings can actually see when they look up in the air. And here, the heavens, more than heaven, right? That's how our translation puts it, which is probably a little better. And then he separates the water from the land, and you get water and dry land, right? And he calls the water seas and the dry land earth, Adam. he does the plants come next. God said, let the earth sprout vegetation. So then we're going to sort of climb the ladder of the great chain of being here. For he's going to create plants first, right? We're going to go sort of in order of complexity. Plants come first, and then the plants start to grow, and then that's the third day, right? And then he creates the stars, the sun and the moon, right? The great luminary to rule the day, the lesser luminary to rule the night. That's the sun and the moon, right? That's the fourth day. And then on the fifth day, he creates animals. First, we get the insects, right? Swarm of living creatures. And then the fowl that fly over the earth, the birds, right? And then sea creatures. And then things that crawl. And all the animals, basically, right? Well, not all the animals. There's sort of like the lower animals. Insects, birds, fish, sea creatures, right? And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters of the seas and let the fowl multiply upon the earth. And that's the fifth day, right? And then in the sixth day, we get the higher animals, the mammals, right? Cattle and creeping beasts and the beasts of the earth according to their kind. And it was so. And then most importantly, then we get to the real crucial thing, right? And God said, this is Genesis 1:26. We're still on page 80. And God said, let us make man in our image. And our translation has, let us make human in our image, which is, of course, better because we're not just talking about the male gender, we're talking about human beings. And so the language is less gendered in our translation, but let us make man in our image after our likeness, and they shall rule over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the heaven and over the animals and over all the earth and over all the creeping things that creep upon the earth. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the sky and over all the beasts that tread upon the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every seed-bearing herb which is upon the surface of the entire earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit, it will be yours for food, etc., etc. And then God saw all he made, and behold, it was very good, and it was evening and morning, the sixth day. And those are the 6 days of creation. And then we all know on the seventh day, he rests, and that's the origin of the Sabbath, or Shabbat, as Jews call it, the day you do nothing. You rest from work, and a very important and holy day for Jews, Christians. The day you go to church, it's not so much a special ritual in the same sense. Well, that's not true. I don't know. Whatever. Sabbath, Shabbat, it's still an important day today for millions of people. This idea that there was a day that God rested, so we mark that out as special. But just note here, okay, we have here a cosmogony in Genesis 1. And you look, for instance, at the creation of humans. God says, let us make man in our image. Who's he talking to? Who's us? No real consensus on that. Are they angels? Whatever. Some kind of heavenly council. Doesn't matter. Well, it matters, but we can't talk about everything right now. He speaks human beings into existence, the man and the woman at the same time. Male and female, he created them. Doesn't give them names or anything like that. Just, and you could say, okay, that's Adam and Eve, right? But that's not Adam and Eve. It's a different story, right? This is God, Elohim, speaking human beings into existence, male and female at the same time. That's the cosmogony of Genesis 1. 6 days of creation, and then the day of rest. It's a story we're very familiar with. We're also familiar, though, with this other story, the story of Adam and Eve. And this is where we get into this idea of the fact that Genesis, the Hebrew Bible, or any, the Bible itself, is not a coherent, unified text. It is a collection of different fragments of stories from different time periods. Okay, Genesis 2. Let me skip ahead a little bit here. In Genesis 2, we get a totally different cosmogony. All right. And when I say totally different, I mean totally different, and it's not subtle, right? Right. So we got the day of rest here, and then God completed on the seventh day. Elohim completed on the seventh day his work that he did, and he abstained on the seventh day from all his work that he did. And on the seventh day he rested, right? And then starting in Genesis 2 verse 3, boom, we're starting a new story. Sorry, in 4, not 3. I have to zoom out a little. What's going on here? Okay. So God blesses the seventh day. Okay. Genesis 2:4, we start a new cosmogony. And let me come back to my PowerPoint for a second. What I'm going to talk about now is, well, no, hang on. Before I get to the PowerPoint, let me show you what I'm talking about, and then we'll slide over to the PowerPoint. All right. We'll have a little lag here. Why is it lagging? Oh, whatever. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created on the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven. Close a couple windows here because I feel like I don't need all this stuff open. Maybe it'll help things go a little faster. All right. Okay. Yeah, that seems to have helped. Okay. We're starting a new story. Now, no tree of the field was yet on the earth, neither did any herb of the field yet grow. What? Because you just told us in Genesis 1 that on the third day, I think it was, you brought forth all the plants, the herbs of the field and everything. Elohim did, right? So why is Genesis now saying, now no tree of the field was yet on the earth, neither did any herb of the field grow? Well, if you ask a rabbi or a priest or a minister to explain this, they'll tell you that, well, this is just like we're going back here and we're filling in some of the details. But if you ask a scholar, what they'll tell you here is that we have now a different story from a different time by a different author that has been incorporated and sort of folded into the texture of Genesis and made to try to seem like a unified whole, although there are clearly contradictions, right? The first and most important thing to note is that all of a sudden, God is now the Lord, or the Lord God. Look at our translation for a second, and you will see that this word Lord is written with all caps, all capital letters, very small. This one doesn't do it. That's how it's usually done. Here you just get Lord written out regularly, Lord. But if you look in our text, you'll see on page 81, the third paragraph in Genesis, the second paragraph in Genesis 2, third paragraph overall on the page. On the day the Lord God made earth and heavens, no shrub of the field being yet on the earth, and no plant of the field yet sprouted. For the Lord God had not caused rain to fall on the earth, and there was no human to till the soil. That word Lord does not appear in the Hebrew text, right? That is a substitution for the word that actually appears. And the word that actually appears is a 4-letter word, a tetragrammaton, it's called here. So the Lord God, if I go over here to the Hebrew, I can find it for you and pull it out. This is the word. Here's the word Elohim, which means God, and the word before it, which is translated as Lord, is not the word Lord. It is the tetragrammaton. Yud He Vav He in Hebrew, YHWH, if we want to use English rough equivalents, right? So let me paste this in here. And this word is YHWH. I mentioned before the Hebrew has no vowels, right? Whoops. I don't know what's going on here. Thing's crazy. My cursor is so confused. When I paste in the Hebrew, it wants to go right to left instead of left to right. So we have Elohim, which is the word for God in Genesis 1, just Elohim, God. But in Genesis 2, we get YHWH, which we scholars today, or everybody universally agrees, is the word for the Canaanite god Yahweh, who didn't start out as the one God, right? Yahweh. So, but was originally part of a kind of pantheon of Canaanite deities. They were, in other words, the people that lived in ancient Canaan and Bronze Age Canaan, right? Like the ancient Akkadians, Sumerians, Babylonians, all of them were not monotheists. We think of the Hebrew Bible as the origin of monotheism, right? This great monotheistic text, and Jews as the progenitors of monotheism, and they certainly were, right, in important ways. But Yahweh, if you look back at the origins of Yahweh as a deity, he doesn't start out as the one God. He starts out as part of a pantheon, as part of a collection of Canaanite gods. He was this sort of Canaanite storm god, this war god, part of a larger pantheon that included El, Asherah, Baal. You may have heard of him. Baal even shows up in the Bible, at least was referred to as a kind of rival of Yahweh. And it's not entirely clear, like, at what point things changed. But if you look at the Bronze Age origins of Yahweh, they are not monotheistic at all. They are polytheistic. And at some point, they become what is called Yahweh worship. At some point, becomes what is called monolatry. No, shoot, I can't think of the word now. They worship one God, but they still believe in other gods, right? And that is, in many ways, seems to be the tenor of a lot of the Hebrew Bible, right? There are these other gods, they exist, but Yahweh is the one true God, or the best God, or the most powerful God, and he's the only God for us, right? In the Bronze Age, the Levant and the Middle East, right, there was a God for every people, right? The Hittites had their gods, the Amorites had their gods, the Amalekites had their gods, and the God of the Israelites was Yahweh. He was their national God in some ways, right? It evolves into something monotheistic, of course, over the course of centuries, from believing that Yahweh is part of a pantheon of other gods to believing that Yahweh is part of a pantheon of other gods, but he's the only one we worship and he's the best one, right? To true monotheism, which is God is the only God. Yahweh is the only God. And that's when you get to the 10 Commandments. The first commandment of the 10 Commandments in the book of Exodus is, I am Yahweh thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. I think about that though. You used to hearing it as I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. But of course, Lord, the word Lord is not there. It's Yahweh. I am Yahweh thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. If you note, it doesn't say you won't believe that other gods exist or that other gods don't exist. Just that you won't worship any of them before me, right? You won't have anything to do with those other gods. And so gradually it evolved into monotheism, but it didn't start out that way, right? It started out like very much something like what we see in Gilgamesh, where you have this pantheon of gods, right? Now I've given this like cool little. This is a little bit of the book of the Song of Deborah, which is the actually some of the oldest stuff in the Hebrew Bible. This is from the very late Bronze Age, probably. It appears in the book of Judges. And the description of Yahweh here is very much in the vein of like an ancient Near Eastern war god or national god, right? Not this Ruach Elohim, this spirit, somebody's spirit floating over the waters, but somebody who's down in there who's going to help you kick some ass, right? Yahweh, when you went out of Seir, when you marched out of the field of Edom, the earth trembled, the sky also dropped. Yes, the clouds dropped water, the mountains quaked at Yahweh's presence, even Sinai at the presence of Yahweh, the God of Israel. From the sky, the stars fought. From their courses, they fought against Sisera, who was a rival god. Right? Yahweh, the God of Israel. They trembled before your might. And that's like, that is Yahweh. And it's like OG Yahweh, right? Before he became something else in Genesis 1, right? Let me flip back over to the PowerPoint for a second. How are we doing on time here? I don't even want to look. So what I want to talk about here is the documentary hypothesis. Come on. All right. So bottom line here, there is no single author or year of composition for Genesis or the Hebrew Bible overall. Genesis 1 comes first, but is more recent than Genesis 2, right? In Genesis 1, you've got Elohim creating in 6 days and then resting on the seventh day, creating with his voice, right? In Genesis 2, you have Yahweh Elohim, where he's named, right? And so what the theory is that these are two different stories by two different authors, right? And there's, since the early 20th century, scholars have theorized about the existence of multiple authors, and the one common way of thinking about it is according to what's called the documentary hypothesis, which is that we've got four major authors of the Hebrew Bible. In Genesis, you've got three authors. There's a Deuteronomist. He doesn't appear in Genesis. But you've got the J author, who is the Yahwist, and he's the one that uses the name Yahweh when he writes. And then you've got the Elohist author. He's the one that uses just Elohim, God. A priestly source that is like somebody who revised earlier Yahweh stuff, and whether Genesis 1 is Elohist or priestly, I think there's disagreement about that. The theory is that because it's Yahweh Elohim, that or that Genesis 2 maybe was priestly because they took the Yahweh source and they attached the Elohim to it. Whatever, it doesn't matter. The point here is you got one author that uses Yahweh, you got another author that uses Elohim. They are different people writing in different times. And it's generally believed that the Yahweh source is the older source, and it used to be thinking that this source was from around 1000 BC, maybe early Iron Age or mid Iron Age, right? But they're always changing their minds about when it was written. Like I said, there's a lot of guesswork involved. But most people agree that the Elohist source is later. That the Elohist, by the time you get to the Elohist source, the Elohim, the Ruach Elohim, this God is a spirit creating with his voice, you have a more maturely evolved monotheism where God is this all-powerful, all-knowing, all-being, omniscient force, the only God that exists. Whereas the Yahweh source still talks about Yahweh as more like what an ancient Near Eastern god was, right? Somebody that is sort of like a physical presence that is, even though there are no gods specifically referred to in Genesis, at least the modern version of Genesis that we have today, that he exists as sort of part of a pantheon, but he is the best of them, something like that, or the national God of Israel, whatever. But let me show you something, because in Genesis 2, you can see how different Yahweh is than the Ruach Elohim of Genesis 1. So now no tree of the field was yet on the earth, neither did any herb of the field yet grow, because the Lord God had not brought rain upon the earth, and there was no man to work the soil. Sorry, I should read this correctly. I tried to say Yahweh instead of Lord. A mist ascended from the earth and watered the entire surface of the ground, and Yahweh God formed man from the dust of the ground. And this is like Enkidu and Ninurta, right? God is forming him from the dust of the ground, and you could picture Yahweh like actually getting in there and scooping the earth up and like making a man out of it, right? And he breathed into the nostrils the breath of life. Now that's ruach coming back. It doesn't matter. All right, I can't. I'm not gonna spend a bunch of time searching for the word ruach in the Hebrew, but it's there, right? So God breathes, life into Adam. He like makes. Just imagine like he makes this man right out of dirt, and it's just laying there, and then he goes down and he's like into the nostrils. He's there. He's actually leaning down and blowing into the nostrils. This is Yahweh, who's like, an embodied thing. And then Yahweh plants a garden in Eden. And he placed there the man whom he had formed. And he doesn't say, let there be Eden. He plants it. Physical actions, right? And okay. And then, what's the creation of Eve, right? Then we get, okay. I want to get to the story of Adam and Eve, but I think I'm going to do that in the next lecture because we're already sort of running out of time here, right? But the cool thing to note here, the main takeaway here is that the Hebrew Bible is not one thing, right? It is a mishmash of different sources, and that even the conception of God in the Hebrew Bible that we think of as being so, different from these ancient peoples with their crazy pantheons of gods is actually not that far removed. You can see the sort of evolution of Yahweh from being this sort of pantheistic God to being the first among equals to being this almighty spirit Elohim. It's not something that happens overnight. It's something that happens over centuries. All right. So my next lecture, which I'll probably get to tomorrow, will deal with Adam and Eve, and then also perhaps Noah. We got to talk about the flood too. All right. But I'll sign off for now. All right. Thank you very much for hanging in there with me. And where is my... this thing's working, right? All right. I will see you next time.